Good morning, everybody. My name is Geoff Garrett. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, and I think this is actually my last official act as head of the centre, because the 30th of September it is, and that's the last day in my job. I couldn't be more pleased than to be with you all this morning and to be with a live streaming audience on the Sydney Morning Herald's website to bring to you a fantastic session with three world-class journalists on what's going on in the United States at the moment when it comes to the election. So to my immediate left is my friend and colleague at the Centre, Jim Fallows, who's also national correspondent with The Atlantic. And Davies, who was in Washington for 2008 covering the election of Barack Obama for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, is now a senior investigative editor at the paper. Nick Bryant from the BBC has covered Australia for the BBC, was also in the US for the turbulent end of the Clinton administration, beginning of the Bush administration. We have three people of three different nationalities, each of whom has enormous understanding of and insight into the US. So I don't want to talk very much this morning, but I do want to do two things. The first is to throw some rapid-fire questions at our panel to get some juicy material on the table, and to hope that that juicy material will lead all of you to ask us even more provocative questions. I'm really looking forward to the session. Let's start. When I started thinking about this session a few weeks ago, I was wondering what the first question should be. But I think today, given everything that's gone on in the US in the past 2 or 3 weeks, the first question for our panel, rapid fire please, 30 seconds if you can do it. How can Barack Obama lose this election?
The answer would be with difficulty, and it's important in American politics to stipulate always that anything could happen because surprises occur. I once worked for Jimmy Carter as a speechwriter in the 1976 campaign. We thought we were going to win easily. We came within a hair of losing to Gerald Ford. Things could happen, but the reasons why it's going to be hard. Number one, in modern history, nobody as far behind as Romney is now has ever won. Number two, early voting, which is a new thing, locks in those results. Number three, Romney is just a terrible candidate. I think the worst we've seen in modern time.
So the answer is Barack Obama can only lose if Mitt Romney isn't the candidate. A difficult counterfactual. Anne, have you got a stronger how Barack Obama could lose?
I could imagine him losing if there was some disaster that he handled really, really badly. So it'd have to be like the hurricane down in New Orleans or something like that, where he was really, really poor at managing it.
Okay, so the big example, the Jimmy Carter example, and of course you'd left Jim by then, was Iran hostage crisis. So, I mean, are you really saying that, you know, the only thing that's on the agenda at the moment that could blow up Barack Obama would be an explosion, an enormous explosion in the Middle East, maybe centred on Iran?
I think so. I think early voting is going to help him an enormous amount. And, you know, even if we get a really bad unemployment figure, I don't think it will be enough to demonstrate a trend that's going the wrong direction for him.
Okay, so we'll talk about this week, which I guess is Romney's last gasp week, in a second. Nick, what do you think?
I'm minded of what was said of Louisianan politics. You can survive anything apart from waking up with a dead woman or a live boy. And I think we're almost into that kind of territory now. But a couple of things could happen. I mean, next week we've got the presidential debate. They'll be looking for a knockdown punch, although historically speaking, blood on the canvas is relatively rare in presidential elections. That's presidential debates. We can talk about that a little bit later. Unemployment figures will come out. They'd have to be really catastrophic, I think, if they were really going to shift the dynamic of this debate. And when you hear somebody like Karl Rove, the senior Republican analyst, saying, we can win without Ohio. There are 11 ways we can win without Ohio. Now, as you all know, every Republican presidential candidate, the only way to the White House is generally to win Ohio. It's a must-win state. It's a bit like the Liberals saying we can win a federal election without winning a single seat in New South Wales. Technically, it's possible, but it just isn't going to happen. So when you hear a Republican like Karl Rove say something like that, you know that they're in really serious trouble. Jeff, one thing I do think that Mitt Romney might have on his side is journalistic boredom. Yeah. Journalists get very bored about writing the same story every day, and they've had the same story pretty much now for the last month, and that's the Obama cruising to victory. I think journalists will be looking for anything that they can glean from the debate or anything they can glean from the unemployment figures to try and write a comeback narrative. And I think that is one thing that might help him. Will it help him enough? I'm very reluctant to call an election this early, but it seems...
Okay, so the reason we're there, the reason we're in this place is because Mitt Romney became Mr. 47%. We believe that someone who was a member of the wait staff in a high roller event where people were paying $50,000 a seat to listen to Mitt Romney used an iPhone to video Romney's speech, in which Romney not only said 47% of the electorate was never going to vote for him, but they were indigent freeloaders on society who expected things like roofs over their head and health care.
And food.
Oh, and food too, that's right. I forgot the third one. Now, Anne, this is a perfect confluence of modern American politics. After the campaign finance reform, you're only supposed to be able to give $2,300 as an individual to a presidential candidate, but these people were paying $50,000 a seat to listen to Mitt. And this would never have been an issue if it wasn't for the confluence of iPhones and YouTube. So what does that tell you about contemporary politics in the US and maybe more broadly?
Well, I think the first lesson is whatever you do, don't open your mouth unless you're happy to have it filmed. It's just absolutely the rule now. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking to just a small group of friends or not, it's probably going to get out. The other thing I think that's happening is that you're getting a world where people can choose what they want to watch. And so you can live in a world where you only get conservative commentators. You can live in a world where you only listen to liberal views. And I think that's adding to the polarisation. So you're getting a very strange sort of... So
the problem, I mean, you're surely right about politicians have to be careful of every word that comes out of their mouth. But that leads to this robotic politician who, you know, the transformation of Julia Gillard from somebody who seemed to be quite good on her feet in Parliament to being a robot as Prime Minister. I mean, what do you think about this, Nick? Is this the death of politics, that politicians have to be so scripted, so driven by focus groups that they'll never say anything authentic?
I think the worst gaffes, Jeff, are always the ones that reinforce the negatives about a candidate.
Yes.
And that was the problem with the 47% line. It reinforced this idea that Mitt Romney was this rich guy, out of touch with the election, the sort of guy that in a debate in the primaries will have a $10,000 bet with his rival.
And he's got in his pocket, yeah, here, I'll pull my $10,000.
The sort of guy that'll, you know, pay for a car lift, things like that. And that was part of the problem with the 47% thing. And the problem of any worse gaffe is one that does tend to reinforce what the voters negatively think about you. So I think that was... But I do think that Mitt Romney's problems began way before that. I think that was just a kind of reinforcing video rather than a transformative video, in the sense that I think many people already had formed that view of Romney, that he was that kind of guy. And this, for them, was kind of...
The icing on the cake. Now, Jim, I know you want to say that Mitt Romney is the worst candidate for president in your living memory. So who are the contenders and why?
The contenders, and let me say a word about the context of saying that somebody's a bad candidate, because you're right that the pressures, there are all sorts of fundamental pressures now that affect how anybody performs. You're on camera all the time. You have to be conscious of that. You're raising money all the time. You're recognizing these polarized environments. Any Republican candidate is straddling awkwardly a party moving right and having to go to the center for the election. So it becomes a question of sort of basic, the political counterpart of basic athleticism or sort of general IQ. And, for example, Bill Clinton is operating in this same environment, and he doesn't seem robotic. Barack Obama has his own, sort of spontaneous way. So do a number of Republicans. Herman Cain, he had a certain...
Until he ummed and ahed a little bit.
So, and Romney simply doesn't know how to do it. When he's prepared in debates, he's actually pretty good. Anything that requires improvisation, he's bad. I think the people in modern history with similar sort of frayed or dulled nerves, John Kerry would be one of them, probably. Al Gore, his sequence of 3 debates showed sort of not really having the right ear for things. We go back to Michael Dukakis, who actually was way ahead.
So we've got 3 terrible Democratic candidates.
But then we have Thomas Dewey.
Okay.
So Thomas Dewey, of before any of our lifetimes, was assumed by everybody to beat Harry Truman in 1948, but he didn't.
But it's very interesting that Jim has named 3 politicians from Massachusetts. And this is not only sort of geographically significant, it's politically significant. It's very hard for a northerner now to win presidential elections. Ever since the sort of civil rights era, there's a massive realignment of American politics. As you know, the American South used to be the solid Democratic South. Republicans just didn't do well there, obviously, because they were the party of Abraham Lincoln. And the civil rights era shifted that. And 50 years ago, Mitt Romney would have been a pretty good Republican candidate because he represented the Republican Party as it was then. And now, of course, he struggles massively because he has no natural affinity for a party whose centre of geographic gravity and political gravity has shifted to the south. And Democrats have the same problem, which explains why Dukakis struggled and why Kerry struggled. Barack Obama was not only the first black president to win the presidency, he was the first Northern Democrat to win the presidency since John F. Kennedy, for similar reasons. You need to be conservative now, like Clinton, like Jimmy Carter, like LBJ, argue like Al Gore. Some Democrats would still argue that he won the presidential election. It's very difficult for Northerners now to win presidential elections, and explains part of Romney's problems. He tries so hard to be the candidate of the South, and he sounds so phony when he does so.
And I agree pretty much. But remember that if, 60,000 votes in Ohio had gone the other way, sure, John Kerry would have won.
Sure.
And Dukakis, maybe if he hadn't gotten in the tank,
sure.
would have won. So I agree about fundamentals.
Now let's talk constituencies, Anne, for a second. So we're dumping on Mitt Romney, but I think it's true that Romney is still the candidate of white America, and certainly white male America. So the Democrats have, and Barack Obama has, ethnic minorities and women. What do you think about that kind of polarization of contemporary politics? Is that understandable, natural? Is it a good thing? Would a better candidate be able to cross some of those divides? And remember, there's the flip side. Barack Obama does terribly among white men unless they're highly educated.
Yeah. But you've got to remember, the election does come down to a very few states with a small number of people, and it is those white males who seem to be the swinging voters that everyone's chasing. So that's what they're after, and so they're honing their messages to those people, I think. It happens in Australia too. They really get focused on very small groups of people in marginal seats, and that's where they're putting all their efforts. It's just modern politics. Maybe it's the way the society has aligned. I don't know.
So I agree with much of that. When Nick was saying about the sort of shift of the Republican strategy in the post-Nixon years, the white South used to be pure Democratic, now it's pure Republican. That worked for the Republicans great for a couple of decades, but now they are really worried because they're horribly weak among African Americans. The latest poll showed it was 95-0 for Obama versus Romney, with 5 undecided among African Americans. Latinos, a huge spread. Women, a very significant spread. So it's only older white males, especially in the South, a diminishing group, and so they have really long-term demographic problems.
So there's this other demographic change in the United States that, when you're living in the US, and particularly in some states, you feel it viscerally, but maybe to Australians it wouldn't be so apparent, which is that Latinos are now a larger minority group than African Americans. And the one that I guess I think about there is the Mountain West, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona maybe, that I used to think of as the Ronald Reagan cowboy states. This was where Republicans couldn't lose, but now it's looking increasingly like it'll be hard for Republicans to win. Why? Because they've taken such a strident stand against undocumented migrants. So what do you think about that social cleavage, Nick. This was an opportunity for Republicans because Latinos are socially conservative, at least.
Well, it's remarkable. When I was in Washington, Karl Rove was talking about a permanent Republican majority. He was talking about building a party that would... I mean, the Republican Party has done very well in presidential elections over the last sort of 30 years. And he was talking about a party that would win every single presidential election, and they would also win majorities in the House and the Senate. They would have this kind of grip on Washington because they would have this permanent Republican majority. And what they haven't played very well is the demographic politics of America, as you say. I mean, they've alienated a huge swathe of the biggest voting bloc now, if we can talk in those old-fashioned terms, is this Latino bloc, and they're completely alienated with their hard line on immigration. The female vote, obviously they've alienated so many females with their very tough line on abortion and choice and birth and things like that. They've played the demographic politics awfully. And actually what the Democrats have done is played the politics pretty well. I mean, for a black man to win the state of Virginia is extraordinary. And that's what happened in 2008. And the Democrats have just been much better at appealing to the kind of the core electorate that you need now to win elections.
Okay, but the amazing thing about this is not what the 2012 election was supposed to be about. The 2012 election, for every political science model that's ever been run, should have been a referendum on the performance of the US economy, and in particular on the unemployment rate. And if Barack Obama is re-elected, he'll be the president re-elected with the highest unemployment rate in history. How did it go so wrong?
Number one, life is unpredictable. The 2008 election was supposed to be about Iraq. That was how Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton. It ended up being about financial disaster, in addition to Iraq. Second, the two contending narratives all the way along.
But nothing has happened to derail, nothing in the real world has happened to derail the unemployment referendum election.
There has, so I'm going to say that the Republicans have been hoping all along it would be a 1980 referendum where just people felt they weren't better off enough, and they had to, Ronald Reagan famously asked about, when challenging Jimmy Carter, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Enough people felt no. They were willing to take the leap with Reagan. Enough things are going better. The situation is bad, but the trends are positive, number one. And number two, led by Bill Clinton, the Democrats have with bit in teeth said, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? You sure as hell are. And they have, the stock market at half the current level and just, catastrophe every place. So they're saying, yes, we're worse off than we would like to be, but we're a lot better off than we were at the end of the Bush administration.
But this is bizarre, and Jim wears his democratic heart on his sleeve. So
my American heart.
Here, that's true. Outside the country, you're an American, but inside the country, I think it's fair to say that you're a Democrat. Jim Fallows just said that there's an appeal to the Democrats that says, don't worry about the unemployment rate, the stock market has recovered.
No.
I mean, this is a kind of bizarre politics.
No, I was saying, the first thing I said, you will note, was that all the trends are positive. The unemployment rate has been improving now for 2 years or so. Private hiring has been going up for 2 years. Obama never mentions the stock markets, but he knows that 401ks, and but the scenes they show of 4 years ago right now were of meltdown everywhere that generally panicked people.
Yeah, and it's true that we all remember that Barack Obama was elected not because of Iraq, but because Lehman Brothers fell on September the 15th, when I think McCain was still ahead in the polls. So, what do you think, Anne, about this? The sort of wizened view of this would be it is the economy stupid and the unemployment rate should be determinative. So has Obama done something brilliant, with the statistics, or have the Republicans just done so badly that that's not how the election is being framed?
I think Obama did two things. First of all, he defined Romney as a vulture capitalist really early on. This sort of phrase that makes him sound really evil, that he's out of touch. So that was a good start. The second thing I think they've done is that the Obama camp keep talking about the future, and they're talking about jobs in green jobs in the car industry and a whole lot of areas. So they're holding out some vision of the future, which, with the unemployment line either flatlining or improving slightly, people can see that there's something in the future. Whereas I don't think Romney's been able to paint that other than this sort of very simple trickle-down economics theory.
Well, of course, Nick, the Romney team, when they selected Paul Ryan to be the VP candidate, actually went on the front foot. And they said, now is the time to gut the American welfare state. A kind of British austerity move in the UK. So was that a dumb idea by them?
It's very hard in the midst of a recession like this for an American candidate, vice president candidate to say we're going to gut the welfare state. I mean, that shifts the narrative as well. I mean, I think when we look back on this campaign, giving Ryan the vice presidential nomination possibly was a mistake because it embroiled the Republicans in this debate about welfare when the debate should really be about jobs. I mean, I think there's a direct analogy that you can draw with 2004, and in a way, Mitt Romney has been swift-boated. 2004, America was involved in two difficult wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. John Kerry was a guy who had a terrific war record, a hero in Vietnam, and of course the Republicans just took that away from him. They swift-boated him. That just wasn't available to him because they managed to redefine what that war record meant. And they've done the same with Mitt Romney. Obviously with the Bain, I'm a turnaround guy, that really should have been one of his most resonant messages during this campaign. I'm the guy that can really come in, as I did with Bain, as I did at the Olympics, and turn this economy around. But again, as Anne says, they've allowed the Obama campaign to define them rather than define themselves. But it goes back to what Jim says. I mean, the guy's a very flawed candidate, and his inability to define himself has been this huge problem throughout. Who is Mitt Romney? I mean, we're 4 weeks away from the election now, 5 weeks, and we still don't really know.
The swift voting comparison is one that I've made myself in print a couple of times, and I think there's a distinction here we have to make. Swift voting, for those of you who don't recall, John Kerry, I think, foolishly began his 2004 acceptance speech, with a salute saying, John Kerry reporting for duty, which was seen as going too far or showboating. And there were these so-called swift voters for truth who put out what was, I believe, objectively a phony narrative that John Kerry had not really been wounded or whatever. The attacks on Romney, I think, have had the same effect. They've had the swift voting effect without being false. I don't know if there's any actual lies people have said about Romney. It's more been sort of showing his record. For example, there's a video in the last couple of days circulating where he's making a promotional pitch for Bain Capital saying, we find companies, we invest, and then we harvest them after 6 to 8 years in hope of a profit. It was sort of like Soylent Green or something. It just had the wrong connotation. I was talking about harvesting these enterprises.
And of course, the way you harvest, it's called stripping and flipping, isn't it?
Yes.
That's the way you harvest. So it certainly was a challenge. And of course, back in the Kerry case, one reason that swift voting had the resonance was because there was also the camera footage of John Kerry after he came back from Vietnam, being speaking out against the war, and clearly that would have mobilised the right. But this brings me to another, I think, extraordinary feature of this election, which is how irrelevant foreign policy is, particularly given how the world and how Australia thought about Barack Obama in 2008. Now, of course, foreign policy is rarely a big story in American politics, but I think it is important to remember that what have we got going on at the moment? No one has a good word to say about Afghanistan. Syria is an unmitigated disaster, but no one seems to be willing to do anything about Syria. Iran-Israel nuclear confrontation is a very, arguably the biggest impending crisis in world politics, and the promise of the Arab Spring seems to have blown up with the assassination of an American ambassador. So I guess the question to all of you is, with a foreign policy in this environment.
But I think Obama can respond to everything you said with a simple bumper sticker. Which
I got Osama.
Obama got Osama.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why foreign policy, he's not so vulnerable in foreign
GM
policy.
is alive and Osama is dead.
It's a great bumper sticker,
And so my premise on this is, number one, foreign policy matters in U.S. elections only when there's some problem. Positive foreign policy you just take for granted. Number two, the Republican team is historically inexperienced in foreign policy, so it's very hard for them to make the case. Number three, there's the Osama factor. Number four, most of the things Obama promised to do in foreign policy mainly containing the exposure in both Iraq and Afghanistan, which is what most Americans wanted. He's basically been able to do. So I think the Libyans killing, that probably is the most problematic, because there are contradictory stories now about what the U.S. government knew.
But it is, I mean, again, I think the point to underline, maybe it's small ball politics, but maybe it's bigger, is that the consensus in the U.S. on let's not intervene is so profound at the moment. I mean, maybe a pairwise comparison would be, you were there, Nick, in 2003. If what was happening in Syria today had happened in 2003, I presume the Bush administration would have, first of all, there would have been airstrikes, there would have been no-fly zone, and maybe there would already be US troops on the ground, and it's just literally unthinkable today, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, one of the two things that Iraq and Afghanistan have done is prevented any future president doing an open-ended military engagement anywhere. And Syria is a result of that policy, and so too Libya, that decided that America now leads from behind. It encourages other people to do its fighting for it, and as it did in Libya. No, I mean, one of the interesting things about Romney is failure to even engage on these issues. I mean, you talk about the difficulties in Afghanistan that America still has, despite the surge, which was the main policy contribution that Barack Obama made. Romney didn't even mention Afghanistan when he made his speech at the GOP convention. And there were various reasons for that, one of which was the turmoil within his campaign in the run-up to that, where the speech had various different authors whose drafts kept on being just thrown out the window and then starting again. And because of that, they made these mistakes, and one of them was not even to mention Afghanistan.
So what do you think, Anne, about this and what it means for the world if this is now the ironclad consensus in the US? We'll look after our own tails first.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think one thing that could potentially change if Romney was elected was whether he changes his stance towards this region. I think Obama's been much more engaged towards the Pacific and China, and Jim knows a lot more about this than me. I think that would be something that could affect all of us here if
okay, so let's go to that. I think this is a very, we've got to do it because, as Jim rightly reminded us, anything can happen. What difference would it make to the US, to the global economy, to the world of international affairs if Mitt Romney becomes president next January?
I would argue that probably surprisingly people who are actual Americans like me would feel more of the difference than anybody who's not an American, because I think there wouldn't be that dramatic a difference in foreign policy. In this part of the world, Mitt Romney says he's going to declare China a cheater on day one. He's not going to do that. I mean, he knows, everybody knows he's not going to do that. And one of the reasons having nothing to do with Romney is that for all the years since Richard Nixon, there's been essential consensus between Republican and Democratic presidents. When they're out of office, they campaign toughly on, that we're being too soft on China. When they're in office, they see the realities of the parameters. So I think it actually would be very little different here.
But what about that? That's an interesting observation on foreign policy. But Nick, one thing that a fired up Republican team led by a president might do is read their own rhetoric on the economy and take stimulus out of the US economy in a massive way by holding a line on all the Bush tax cuts, the so-called fiscal cliff, by saying that we're not going to do a deal on spending. There are estimates that the non-happening of two deals, one on tax cuts and the other on spending cuts, is going to take about 4% out of the US GDP overnight. If something like that happened, isn't that the most cataclysmic thing we should all be worried about?
Well, one of the things that happens generally after a presidential election is a very speedy retreat from all that kind of rhetoric that you hear in a campaign. Going back to foreign policy at the moment and how radically that would shift. One remembers the main promise of Barack Obama previous to 2008, which was to close Guantanamo Bay. Still open.
But the Republican Senate wouldn't let him do it. They wouldn't let him relocate the prisoners.
Sure, but he also realised the legal difficulties of transporting all those people to, and the intelligence consequences of that.
Having trials in New York and other things.
So it wasn't simply a GOP bloc in the Senate that caused that. So I'm almost, this idea that there's going to be radical change overnight. I don't.
But the radical change can happen before Mitt Romney is inaugurated, because it would happen by non-action in the Congress in the so-called lame duck session. So all the Republicans would have to do is decide that they're not going to be sullied by some ugly political compromise. You're laughing, Jim, at this.
Yes, because I will confidently predict here that should Mitt Romney be elected, as none of us is predicting, but if he's going to, the Republican Party is not going to let him be the next Herbert Hoover. They will back away from this idea that budget deficit is the greatest evil of all time. That was very convenient as the Tea Party rallying cry in 2010. But Romney himself is running away from the Ryan budget, and Ryan is his running mate. So I think if he were winning, I don't think he would embrace it.
Okay, so this, we're supposed to have all these dangerous ideas here, and what we've got so far is, don't worry, Barack Obama's going to get re-elected. Oh, and by the way, it wouldn't make any difference anyway.
To you, it'd make it.
So I guess the conceit of the session really was, why are we all so fixated on this? And I think this is an interesting question. I was thinking about it. Think about some other big elections that have happened in the world recently that are quite interesting. I mean, the election of Hollande in France changed the balance in Europe, probably flips the way the EU responds to the fallout from the global financial crisis. The election of David Cameron, in essence, repudiating a lot of Blairism in the UK, was an extraordinary election. I was in Australia for both of those, and no one cared. Literally no one cared, whereas Australians seem to have this minute-by-minute fascination and understanding of the US. Why is that? To you two.
Oh, well, we've got a lot invested in bureaus over there. No, that's not really the reason. I think it's partly Obama's personality, that we're all just fascinated by him. We love the idea that there's this larger-than-life character, and so, there's been polls done in Australia that show that he'd, get 70% of the vote in Australia. So, we love him, and we want him to succeed. So I think that is why there's so much
So you just think it's Obama agony. It's not personality politics on steroids. It's not any of that stuff. What do you think, Nick?
Oh, we love the show. I mean, it's the greatest democratic show on earth. And I speak as somebody who's covered an Indian election, which is fantastically brilliant and colourful and elephants, the whole shebang. But I think if you add up all the other forces in the world, military-wise, you still don't get to America, do you? And I often think that with elections as well. If you add up all the elections in the world in terms of their entertainment value, in terms of their you don't quite still get to the US presidential election. It's become this absurd, elongated carnival now that obviously starts way back in 2011, at the beginning of it, and even before that. And no, there is this fascination with it. I mean, there's a change of leadership in China happening this year, but do we care? I mean, we do. We say we do, and there's a kind of worthy but dull element to the coverage. But of course, we're transfixed by what's happening in America because it's so colourful, because it's so bonkers, because these gaps just continually entertain us. I mean, as it says, just entertainment. I mean, it's a very entertaining process to watch.
And of course, that font of all wisdom on American politics, Jon Stewart, led the Daily Show's coverage of the Republican campaign with the subtitle Jeb Bush, The Road to Jeb Bush 2016. Yes. Now, of course, what I think everybody is looking at is, American politics is often like boxing. We're talking, what would we be up to if it's Clinton Bush in 2016? This would be like Ali Frazier 3 or 4 or something like that. So certainly there is, there's this battle of the Titans quality to all of this stuff. But you know, it's an interesting, I think it's an important debate. On the one hand, we have, boy, the US still really matters in the world, so of course we care about American elections, versus it's just so easy to consume and be involved in these elections because of all the information and entertainment options we've got. What do you think, Jim?
I think it is genuinely entertaining. I speak as someone who went back to look at the tapes of all the Republican primary debates, which were just incredible. I mean, think again of Herman Cain and Newt Gingrich and Michelle Bachmann and Rick Santorum. This was, and Rick Perry.
Rick Perry, I'm going to get rid of 3. Was it 2? What?
Because I mean,
what are those agencies of government anyway?
Because Rick Perry would have been the nominee if there were only 2 or 3 debates, because that's the only thing that derailed him. He'd been a much stronger nominee than Romney. So it's entertaining, but while I'm saying that an Asia-Pacific policy would make a dramatic difference, inside the U.S. it would be really different if Romney wins, because it's a time where the main problem in the United States is polarization of all sorts. You know, economic polarization is at a modern extreme. There's long-term stagnation, political differentiation, and I think the visions of life between today's Republican Party, one of whose Senate candidate is talking about how after a legitimate rape, a woman cannot get pregnant because her machinery shuts down, and the Democratic Party in ethnic terms and all the rest, it really is consequential inside.
But do you think it would be important for those symbolic social issues, or do you think there's a chance under Romney that the Republicans, quote unquote, would tackle the big structural imbalances in the US, most importantly Medicare, which in the US is the healthcare system for the older population?
They would certainly need to tackle them. I'd say let me...
Tackle, of course, is a polite word for privatize at the moment.
So one of the arguments that Paul Ryan made early in his time as vice presidential nominee was that Barack Obama was betraying America's elderly because he was going to cut $716 billion or whatever out of Medicare, not revealing that his plan does that too and refunds it as high-end tax rebates, you know, to people in the top 3%, whereas Obama was trying to shift it into some other coverage aspects. It is, whoever wins is going to have to deal with fiscal imbalances because they are too large. Whoever wins will appoint 2 or probably 3 Supreme Court justices, which also will have, in current politics, that has generations-long effect.
Okay,
now.
so I am mindful of my promise to you that we'd have at least 20 minutes of interaction with the audience. There are 2 microphones, one on either side of this hall at the front. I'm only going to ask one more question of the panel, so anyone who'd like to formulate a question and make your way to a mic, I'd encourage you to do so. Last question for you all. How high would the US unemployment rate have to be next Friday for Mitt Romney to be elected as president?
50.
Okay, so it ain't going to happen from Jim Fallows. Anne?
I don't know, if it bounced back up around 9.5, which is, like impossible as well.
Okay, 9.5, so we're at 8.2. That's impossible. It could go up a couple of tenths of a percent.
Not enough.
Not enough. Nick?
I'm with Jim. I think unemployment's not going to happen at this stage, unless it's a massive, massive jump. Anyway.
Okay, and that surely will be the epitaph of this election, that it just, at the end of the day, it didn't matter that the US economy is still in parlous state.
And so when we say something could happen, it would be like Obama's actual Kenyan father appearing and saying, yes, he was born in Nairobi, or something like that. I think it would require new information.
Or presumably, potentially, although it might not, we just don't know, an Israeli airstrike in Iran or something like that.
Short term, that would probably help Obama.
Obama. Yes. Okay, so first question over here to my right. The far right as I look at it, but the far left as you all look at it.
Good morning, thank you very much. My question is actually about the fascination with US politics from an Australian perspective. Is it more about the style of leadership that Obama represents? I think here in Australia, the politicians strive to be more like average Joe Blow. The vernacular they use, the language they use, they're meant to be like us, whereas Obama is very much, he's a figure to aspire to, he's a real leader. Is that something that captures our imagination, perhaps something that's missing in our own politicians?
Of course, it wasn't there in George W. Bush, who was about as folksy as they get. What do you think?
Look, I think, having listened to many, many Obama speeches over when I was there, I came away thinking if a politician said this over and over in Australia, we would be going, no, that is absolute garbage. You know, we expect our politicians to be a bit more down to earth and a bit more realistic, whereas in America I think they're quite happy to have this sort of soaring rhetoric. And it's because they're not tuning in. A lot of people are not tuning in very regularly, and some people are just completely devoted to it. So,
certainly, some of my Republican friends say that. You know, I was over and done with Obama rhetoric. You know, the 15th time I heard it. When it gets up to the 315th, it's a little tedious. What do you think, Nick?
Oh, it's a little bit like comparing the film industry with Hollywood. I mean, you know, Hollywood is where the really big box office stars are, and occasionally Australia has a brilliant box office star like a Kate Blanchett or something. But you know, most of the box office stars are in the States, and that's partly why. I mean, to give you an indication, I heard a lovely story recently about Billy McMahon. He was the Prime Minister here, obviously about 40 years ago. He was in New York. It was just before he was going to the White House, where his wife wore that very revealing dress. And they had a stray Saturday night in New York, and somebody suggested they go and hear Eartha Kitt sing in Cabaret. Anyway, somebody suggested to Eartha Kitt, the Australian Prime Minister's in the house, you might want to go and serenade him midway through your set. She went up to Billy McMahon's table, she started singing to the man she thought was the Australian Prime Minister. It turned out it was his US security guard. And I think that speaks of the problem in the kind of body language, and in the Australian Prime Ministers tend to sort of deflate themselves, whereas American politicians try everything they do.
Well, of course, I don't know whether many people in the room are old enough to remember just how weird Billy McMahon looked and how easily caricatured he was by cartoonists. I remember that. So, next question over here, now on my far left.
Good morning. I'm mindful that I'm talking to a panel of journalists, and the point was made that Australians, of course, are so interested in the American spectacle, but to what extent is that a failure of the media to tell us why we should care about the Chinese elections or these other major elections? Are they getting caught up in the spectacle and the narrative? Why don't we care, I suppose?
I think all of us would say guilty. I mean, every single presidential cycle, we all sit down and we think we're going to cover this election differently. We're going to cover the issues. We're not going to cover the gaps. We're not going to be sort of diverted by the silly stuff, the kind of cosmetic stuff. But getting journalists to cover a campaign like that is a little bit like trying to persuade a child to eat greens. It's very hard to do, and I think this campaign has actually been worse, partly because of the kind of relentlessness of this 24/7 cycle, the absurdity of the sort of coverage now that you get on things like Twitter, which is, you know, not even who won the day, it's who won the hour. Who won the minute? Who won that kind of exchange and the debate? And I think, you know, it's crazy. And I think as journalists we sort of should accept some level of culpability and responsibility for this. You know, we always say we're going to cover American campaigns slightly differently, and people, you know, frankly, like Jim do. I mean, if you read his piece in the Atlantic Monthly this month, is brilliant, and Jim's coverage is. And there are lots of journalists like Jim, but there is this sort of day-to-day obsession, and it's this sort of sports contest that we kind of get.
Okay, Anne, were you sticking up your hand to go to Paris to cover the presidential election?
No, but I would say we make a big effort to try and cover Chinese politics. We have an excellent correspondent,
yes.
John Garneau.
Yeah, John Garneau, who breaks global news on China, I think it's fair to say.
But, you know, you can't even find out what day it's on, let alone, you know, get in there with an iPhone or tweet out what's happening. You know, it's very difficult. So, you know, one of the great things about the American system is that it puts it all out there for everybody to see.
But did the Herald send, I can't remember, did the Herald send a correspondent to London to cover the 2010 British elections?
We had someone there, but we covered it, you know, as intermittently, I would say, yeah.
So one brief word of explanation for why coverage of this election might be more shallow seeming. The Republicans, for better and worse, decided they're not really presenting a case for what they're going to do for the next 4 years. Their case is the last 4 years haven't worked. And so it's not sort of contending agendas for what we're going to do in Afghanistan or whatever. It's basically trying to make it a referendum election.
And to be fair, again, fair and balanced here, to use that overused and abused term, neither is Barack Obama.
He's right. He's saying essentially, give me a chance to keep. It'll be better if you stay this course. So both sides are essentially arguing whether the last 4 years have been a huge failure or not. And I think all of our news organizations do a lot of China coverage, and because there is the fascination. I mean, you can't. There's no equivalent of the debates, but there is the Bo-Xilai case, which is sort of its own.
Which is extraordinary. Yes. Yeah. Next question.
So everything you're talking about appears to apply mostly just to 10 states in the U.S. A dangerous idea might be for the people in the other 40 states. If you're green and you live in Texas, why would you vote for Obama? Because he's not going to win Texas. Vote for the green candidate. If you're conservative and you don't like religion in the public place, and you live in California or New York, why vote for Romney? You might as well vote for a libertarian. And I love that about Australia. The Greens certainly get more from Julia than the Greens will ever get from Obama.
Okay, now we're talking political science. So it's electoral systems. If only the US either had proportional representation or direct election of the president, the world would be a much better place. Do you agree?
My dangerous idea, the US Constitution is really screwed up in 50 different ways. But also, it's impossible to change. So it's screwed up and impossible to change, and this is our challenge. One way to get around this current electoral college nuttiness, which makes Ohio matter more than any other place on earth, is an initiative that a number of states have now passed, including California, that when enough states approve this to represent a majority in the electoral college, they pledge to allot their electoral votes proportionally. So
how do you think about that one? Proportional allocation of...
I was going to say exactly the same thing. If you want a dangerous idea, you really need to rethink the American Constitution.
Yep.
It not only does credit this weird electoral system, it's credited a system of government which now is in paralysis and at almost a level of ungovernability in Washington. And that's a huge problem. And you should also rethink the nominating process. The fact that it starts... If you were to invent a system that was less representative of America, you'd struggle to do it, quite frankly. Because you'd think, well, where's a really weird state where ethanol subsidies is the biggest issue? Okay, let's go Ohio. Well, we're there already. Let's think of somewhere which is sort of 95% white. Oh, New Hampshire, we do that already. Let's go to South Carolina, which is the next primary, a really conservative state. Done it already. Let's take New York out of the equation, really, and California too, the most populous states that don't really have any impact on presidential campaigns in the nominating process anymore. They did in 2008. Let's do that. Well, we've done it already. The system is very, very flawed. And, the Electoral College, we could go into the detail of that as well. You've got a system, obviously, as happened in 2000, where the candidate who wins the popular vote doesn't necessarily win the presidency. And that is something that America, but as Jim said, is not going to change.
But, of course, there is a flip side, Anne, which is that Bob Carr, that incredible student of American history, in his analysis of the 2010 election for the Labor Party, suggested that there are a lot of elements of American politics that we do well to emulate in Australia, and one of them is moving towards a primary system.
Yeah, well...
Do you think do you think he's right about that?
New South Wales is experimenting with it now. It's quite a limited system. You can join the Labor Party and you can take part in these broader votes. I know that some of the people in the party are interested in having a system a bit like the British system, where members can participate in choosing the Prime Minister. To me, it seems like a good idea for one reason, in that in America everyone is a lot more engaged with, there is a big class of activists who are engaged with the party. In Australia, I think the really sad thing is that political parties have shrunk and they're losing members, and because people feel like they can't be part of the pre-selection system, that it's done behind closed doors by the power brokers.
I have to share with this group. I became an American citizen in 2008, so my first act as an American citizen was to vote in the primary. And I couldn't believe an American primary. The polling place is somebody's backyard. There is there are no officials anywhere. And the person in front of me, this was California, so the ballot paper was, not like that tall, that thick. And somebody in front of me had made a mistake. And so the person who was scrutinising the election said, "Don't worry, I'll just snip the ballot box and I'll pull yours out." I mean, this is an extraordinary thing. The folksiness of this process. Do you think it's an endearing, charming thing, Jim, or?
I think we saw its excesses. That was what gave us Florida 2000.
Yeah.
You know, the accumulation of 1,000 things like that. And I think the serious part of it right now is some of the voter suppression efforts that are underway in a lot of states, which may have the sort of counter effect of mobilizing a lot of early vote turnout. But the American electoral system is really bad. And I think it's only that it's one of many things that America has so far been rich enough and resilient enough to afford, which is this bad political system. And the question is whether that margin of being able to afford it diminishes.
Continues. Next question over on our left.
Well, maybe we've covered all this, and perhaps you can ask the next question, because that was exactly my question about. Every 4 years, the rest of the world is reminded of the inability of America to get past the Electoral College, and we look at states wiping people off the electoral roll and so forth. There's no National Electoral Commission, there's no kind of rule of law about the elections. The elections are held on working days where some people need to queue for hours when they're supposed to be. There are so many things, and the rest of the world looks at the sort of leader of democracy, according to the rhetoric, and looks at how it actually happens on the ground and is completely amazed and shocked.
Okay, so let's focus this in two ways. Nick, you covered 2000, Gore-Bush. And this is a case where the Supreme Court literally decided the outcome of the election. Second case, 2011, Citizens United, the Supreme Court decided that, yes, indeed, money is speech in the US, and as long as you're giving it to something called the super PAC, it can be X million dollars, which kept Newt Gingrich in an election campaign for 6 months. What about those two big things?
Well, I was live on air when the Supreme Court made its ruling in 2000 and had that awful moment where we were trying to decipher this ruling. It was written in legal gobbledygook, and of course, afterwards, the Supreme Court justices who were in the majority said this should not be a precedent because it's so poorly argued, essentially paraphrasing them. I take it back to what you were saying. Further than that, though, I remember waking up the morning after the election. In fact, I didn't even go to bed that night. It was just straight away. And I remember seeing a Florida polling station with yellow police tape outside of it, and it was like a crime scene. And that was probably as it should have been. And I remember Indian officials sort of saying, "Do you want us to send election observers over to America?" There was this wonderful moment where the rest of the world was saying, "Hang on a minute, you've been telling us how to do democracy for donkey's years."
Okay,
we'll return the favour.
What about Citizens United and money is speech, and if you've got more to say?
Yeah, well, I think this is probably the most dangerous part of the American system, that you can basically now donate via these super PACs. It means you donate to this organisation. They don't have to declare who the donors are. Some people out themselves, and it's quite interesting why they say they're donating. For instance, there's been and his name's escaped me,
Joel Needleson?
AKA, yes, Mr. Newt Gingrich.
So the great big casino owner under investigation by the Justice Department, and what he told Mike Allen at Politico, he's done it for self-defence reasons, that's why he is donating first to Gingrich and now to Romney. So that's pretty alarming. And, the same thing happens in Australia. We've now banned donations to developers in New South Wales, which hopefully will help a little bit. Maybe not.
I think the U.S. narrowly avoided a constitutional crisis about 3 months ago when John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, decided not to overrule the Obama health care law. Because if he had ruled to overturn it, I think there would have been a narrative among a lot of the American electorate saying from Bush v. Gore to Citizens United to this health care ruling, you'd had essentially partisan control of the Supreme Court. through most of American history, the Supreme Court has actually been an activist, partisan body, not a sort of detached judicial one. The more judicial restraint one that we think of, say, in the desegregation rulings of the mid-20th century, was the anomaly. I think Roberts was concerned enough about how the court to protect the court that he swung that way.
Yeah, and it wasn't extraordinary. I remember that one. Everyone who's followed the Supreme Court knew it would be 5-4, but they had no idea that the Chief Justice would side with Barack Obama against the Conservatives. Next question.
Morning. I just came back yesterday and from the U.S. and the main argument I get from my Republican family is that Obama is a redistributionist and that they still pay their fair amount of taxes, and they feel it's very visceral when he continues to say on the campaign trail that they're not giving their fair stake. And I wanted to know how in some sections that's playing out in the country and other sections it's not, particularly in New York. I found it to be more playing out that they feel insulted by Obama.
Certainly
do that rhetoric.
I think this is a very, again, you can only appreciate this if you are in the US and you are among Republicans, just how much they hate Obama. I mean, with a passion. But is it because of redistribution or is it other reasons?
Well, Jeff, it's worth pointing out that Barack Obama has been a huge disappointment to many Democrats as well.
Yes.
And, this really should have been the Republicans' year. They should win. They should have won this election, as we were saying earlier.
But, Jim, why do the Republicans hate Obama? Is it because he's a redistributive guy? Is it because he's a black man? What's the big story?
A combination of things. There's some people, some of the animus against Obama is certainly racially motivated, and people feeling this is just, an improper person to be holding the office. Some of it, there is an interesting, and I think not really attractive in human terms, reaction by a lot of Wall Street people who are feeling
they're the worst.
That they did get bailed out. Nobody got prosecuted. They're able to get all these profits. Somehow they still feel picked upon and not appreciated by Obama. Objectively, the level of taxation overall in the U.S. is near a historic low, and the income rate progressivity is much, much lower than it was under Clinton, under Reagan. When I was a kid, in the John F. Kennedy, he lowered the maximum tax rate from 90%, down to whatever it was, 70% or something. And now the effective maximum, for rich people is 15% with the capital gains. And so there's lots of reasons for it, but also there's this sort of self-enclosed information sphere of just thinking that Obama really is a redistributionist, and that is, I think it is a narrative that people just feel beset by.
How important do you think Fox News is in all of this, Sam?
Well, I was going to say, I was talking to our correspondent, Nick O'Malley, and he was saying even inside the campaigns, they sort of have parallel universes.
Yeah.
That they're watching their own media, and it's reinforcing their view about how their campaign's going and also about the ills of each candidate. So I guess Fox News is really important in establishing that narrative that Obama is a big government guy, a big taxer, and dangerous.
But it's a huge problem for Republicans now. You need to win over Fox News, and there's a cost. There's a very big cost of winning over Fox News, and it's you lose CNN, you lose MSNBC, and the math of that adds up to losing an election, arguably.
Next question. Maybe we've got time for two more if they're brief.
Hi. We've talked about the South as being a Republican stronghold, but Bill Clinton actually managed to win a great swath of Republican southern states in his two elections, I think including Georgia and Louisiana. So what does it take for a Democrat to be able to win southern states?
Well, of course, Bill Clinton won against, and I'm surprised he didn't come up, Bob Dole. By God, there was a weak presidential candidate. 1996.
So Bill Clinton was number one, a very gifted politician. Number two, he ran in two unusual circumstances. In 92, it was against the first George Bush, who was a very impressive statesman but a bad politician, and Ross Perot, who was in there sort of splitting vote. In 96, the Republicans, as they appear to be doing this time, are attacking a vulnerable president with not the best candidate. Bob Dole was not the best candidate, but Clinton was Southern. He was able to apply Rhodes Scholar analysis with aw shucks diction, and so he was, in the speech at the Democratic convention, he said, well, how do people think that Obama is taking your money away? I'm fixing to tell you. You know, he said, I'm fixing to, and he went on, and it was really...
Right,
so,
and no one could imagine Barack Obama confessing to the American public that he had a problem with his Big Mac addiction or whatever it was. Remember when Clinton was trying to jog to the McDonald's?
So human in all ways, Bill Clinton, just overflowing humanity. So I think he's an exceptional case. What will turn the South eventually, it will be the Latino vote, and Texas will become an in-play state pretty soon.
Next and probably last question.
Just pushing the boundaries of dangerous ideas and thinking about 4 years' time, which candidates from the Republican and the Democrat side do you think will be the candidates put forward and be able to navigate the system? And a supplementary, what would be the key issue, the economy, or we have moved on?
All right, 4 years from now, is Bush 3, 4, 5 versus Clinton, whatever? Is that the best guess we've got today, or
On the
not?
Republican side, there is a struggle for the soul of the party, and again, the question presumes that Obama will be reelected this year, as most of the speeches at the Republican convention assumed too. Because Chris Christie gave his
he was
keynote
campaigning.
speech, "Stand with me, and I'll stand with you," and oh yeah, vote for Romney.
Yeah. Marco Rubio, I've got the Republican story.
So I think if the Republicans lose, there will be this struggle for the narrative. Was it because they weren't conservative enough and they should have gone with the pure deal with Ryan and Santorum, or because they needed to swing back? So that we don't know. It'll be those contests.
What do you guys think?
For the Dems, I think it may be Hillary Clinton, and for the Republicans, they need a Clinton. They need a Clinton-like Republican.
And you're not with my guy Jeb Bush, Spanish-speaking Floridian who's intelligent?
He's their best candidate, except for that issue, like his name.
And
well, I thought Tim Pawlenty was quite impressive. He's Midwest state, Minnesota. I think he'll probably put his hand up.
Have you heard him speak?
I was going to say he's going to Minnesotan you into submission.
Okay.
That's the way it's going to go.
And I don't know who it would be, but I could see the Democrats looking for a Latino candidate next time around.
Like the Castro twins from Texas.
Yep. Not Antonio Villaraigosa, the mayor of Los Angeles. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks, Sydney Morning Herald. Please thank Nick Bryant and Davies, Jim Fallows. Thank you very much.